Well, I think everyone does know Dr. Brett Riggs, but we certainly appreciate all the work he's done for the Cherokee people and all of his research and his work saving our various sites. And we're happy that he's on our board for the National Trail of Tears Association. And I'm sure the North Carolina is very happy to have him in North Carolina. So,
it helps that he's a great storyteller. He can
yes.
he can take all these facts and give them a coherent storyline that is entertaining as well as educational.
We'll turn it over to you, Brett.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Troy Wayne. And that's exactly what I want to try to do today, is to share with you a little story, really kind of a personal story about an individual and a family and their experience with the removal, and in this case, their escape from that. And this is really 2 or 3 stories embedded in each other, because Standing Wolf, and as Anita noted, we have Standing Wolf descendants in our audience, in our viewing audience here. Standing Wolf was, for the second half of the 19th century at least, he was perhaps after Sequoyah and maybe John Ross, the most famous Cherokee in America. And he himself did not know that. And so we're going to explore that a little bit, and a little bit about his story and both the ostensible story that was told about him and what the backstory is today. But first, I'd like to do a big shout out and a thank you, a ski, to Anita Finger-Smith. And I pestered her to death about documentary and genealogical details, and she listened to all the crazy stuff I had to say. And then there's many other folks like Mike Wren and Mara Marshall and Robin Swaney, Elizabeth Thomas, Kirk Savage, and Lance Green, who they shared their time, their documentary resources, and their thoughts and ideas about this work in particular. But most of all, I'd like to dedicate this to T.J. Holland. He was former EBCI Cultural Resources Director and Director of the Cherokee Junaluska Memorial Museum, and he was the EBCI representative to the TOTA board. He was a real principal mover in the background research of this story in particular, and he was my friend. He was always ready to conspire about the secret story that's embedded within this. So just to introduce you a little bit to our main character, the Standing Wolf, or Wayakadoga. The Standing Wolf was from Western North Carolina. He was described in the 1840s as being one of the great men of this tribe. He was born back in the 1780s at Tuckaleechee, which was there in Bryson City, and his parents were Will Nody and Betsy. And he had a pretty famous kindred there. So the very well-known Yonaguska, Goldsoi, Big Tom, Nancy Kathata, were his uncles and aunts. And they're really particularly well known as being some of the founding characters of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They also are part of a group that separated themselves from the Cherokee Nation, remained on their old lands after the session of 1819 and took reserves. And so that reserve clause is always sitting in the background for Eastern Cherokees as really kind of an origin point for them as a different political entity. Around 1815, he marries Wagee. That was both of them second marriage, so their children, before that marriage. And he first shows up in the documentary record in what was the true and accurate numeration of Indians in what was the purchase. In other words, the session of 1819. So he was recognized in 1820 as continuing to reside on those lands that were ceded. In 1829, in signing over a power of attorney, he was part of a group that identified themselves as being, as they said, Indians who have separated themselves from the Cherokee Nation and are now citizens of the US. But then they said, but we're ignorant of the English language and the laws and customs of our adopted country. So they needed legal representation. But in 1834, he moves back into the Cherokee Nation. We're not sure why, but he moves to a place called Yellowtown, which is right at the northeastern edge of the Cherokee Nation. And he shows up on the 1835 census as being in Stickoa with 16 people in his household, including 5 of them were Cherokee readers. And his valuation of his property, and that shows up as being at Yellowtown, which was part of Stickoa, included 3 log cabins and a hothouse and 8 acres in cultivation. So it was a farm he was really just getting going at that time, you know, when the Treaty of New Echota had hit and then everything that follows after that. Fast forward to 1838, you know, even though he had been part of this group that had lived outside the nation and people who were known as citizen Cherokees, he's back in the nation at this point. So he is subject to arrest and removal. And on June 4th, his whole family is rounded up by the North Carolina Mounted Volunteers, and they're remanded to Fort Lansing, which is at the northeastern corner of the Cherokee Nation. They stay there between June 20th and July 13th, or excuse me, between June 20th and July 13th, then they travel down to Fort Cass to the immigration depot that's there. But then in late August, that whole group escapes from Fort Cass. They go back to North Carolina and they resettle at what was called Quallatown in September of 1838. Now, Standing Wolf had a long and productive life after that. So he lived at Wolftown from 1840 at least, probably 1838 to 1855. He was one of the founding directors of what was called the Cherokee Company. It was incorporated in the state of North Carolina for the cultivation and manufacture of sugar and silk. And I don't think they made an ounce of sugar or 1 skein of silk the whole time, because it was a shell to facilitate the incorporation of the Eastern Cherokees under the laws of North Carolina. In 1848, the Malay roll shows Standing Wolf, who was by then 60, and Wagee, who was 55, being at Wolftown, and their daughters are living with them and their sons are living close by. In 1855, Wagee dies. In 1856, Standing Wolf then acquires property and moves to Deertown, which is Lower Big Cove. And that's where this newspaper reporter finds him in 1858, and he describes Standing Wolf as being a venerable old Cherokee who's been a member of the church for 23 years. The expression of his countenance is benign, pleasant, and cheerful. He's loved and respected by all who know him. I observed that he still wears the moccasin, the hunting shirt, and the belt with a big butcher knife in it. And even though they'd been talking about him as being old since 1838, when he died in 1864, he was only 76. So that's making me feel pretty old right now. But he left, quite a legacy for the Eastern Band, a large progeny, and his descendants are found throughout the Eastern Band now. And they have made illustrious marks on the history of that tribe. Here's just a map to show you some of those places in case you're not familiar with the fine scale landscape of Western North Carolina, where some of these places are located. So you can see Qualla and Tuckaleechee Town and Yellowtown and all of those places. If we look at it in the political landscape of 1835, 1838, there they were relative to the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation and the county boundaries at that time. So why is he famous? Well, in 1846, this newspaper article came out, and it was first published in the New York Evening Mirror, which just the year before had been the publication that put out Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So it was a famous literary newspaper, and that got picked up by the Boston Recorder, which was also a literary newspaper under the heading of Miscellaneous Anecdote of a Cherokee Indian. And they identify him as Standing Wolf, and then they tell this story about his capture and then ultimately escape and return. So now we have sort of the literary crowd in America and in the Northeast reading about this Cherokee down in North Carolina, in the wilds of North Carolina. But his story then becomes familiar to people all across the country because these articles get picked up. Nobody wants to fill up newspapers by writing. They want to steal other people's articles, and they plug this in all over the country. And so that name Standing Wolf is out there in 1846. And in that story, the writer, who's simply identified as a Washington correspondent, he focuses on two major things. When the soldiers come in on June 4th to arrest that family, Standing Wolf asked them, he asked the interpreter, who is identified here as being Bob the sergeant, he asked the interpreter if they can stop and pray before they leave. And the interpreter says yes. And he then leads the family in song, and they fall to their knees and pray. And the author here says he prayed the Lord Jesus to forgive the white people. That's what he's praying for, because even though they were treating him and his family and their fellow countrymen as brutes, they didn't understand. They did not know what they were doing. And this played tremendously with the literary crowd and the newspaper readers of America, because what it did is it not only gave Standing Wolf, this character who had just entered their life, the sort of a moral high ground, that he had, accepted Jesus Christ, and that now he was praying for the souls of the soldiers, for the souls of the white people. And of course, there was a lot of guilt floating around in America about, this was one of the great sins of America, was Indian removal and what had happened there. And here they have in print a Cherokee who is praying for their forgiveness. And so it really strikes a chord with folks. And that passage is constructed to do exactly that. The other thing that the writer, this correspondent, focuses on is that one of the officers, then after he's down at Fort Cass, one of the officers gives him permission to go back home, because Standing Wolf was a citizen, that he was a citizen of the state of North Carolina because of that treaties, the treaties of 1817 and 1819 conferring citizenship. This is a real interesting legal point that the author is putting out there for the American readership to understand. So there's, behind this story, this very affecting story, there's an agenda. And that's the agenda of this guy, William Holland Thomas, Willie Oosty, or Little Willie. He was the principal agent and representative for the Eastern Cherokees, or citizen Cherokees, beginning as early as 1831 and right on up into the 1870s. So this guy has a very prominent role in the history, in the Eastern Cherokee history. Now, Little Willie had grown up with the Cherokee communities on the Oconaluftee River. And many of these folks were his main neighbors and his primary influences. He was even adopted by the leader, Yonagaska, whatever that adoption meant. What that would then imply is he's the adoptive first cousin of the Standing Wolf. And he spoke the Cherokee language. And he learned the Cherokee language from Standing Wolf's stepson. So there's connections between Will Thomas and the Standing Wolf already. Now, Will Thomas in 1846, when this article is published, is in Washington, D.C., lobbying on behalf of the Eastern Cherokees in the settlement for that new agreement, that 1846 agreement. He wants to make sure that the Eastern Cherokees are included in all the benefits that are going to accrue to the Cherokee Nation, but then they don't have to immigrate. So he was a pretty smooth operator there. And one of the things he does, apparently, is he gives this story to a Washington correspondent to put out there to show the position of the Eastern Cherokees as being both citizens of the state, as being laudable citizens, as being Christians, but then also that they should remain in the state of North Carolina as good citizens. So that story, it goes out into America, but it is projecting this agenda. Will Thomas had done a whole lot to make sure that Standing Wolf was going to be there. So one of the things that Thomas had done as a representative of the citizen Cherokees is he had lobbied in Washington, D.C. again in 1836. He'd hobnobbed with the Cherokee Committee, in fact, with all of the Treaty Party people there, to try to get a special deal cut for these folks who lived over on the Oconaluftee River. And the best he could do was to get folks who were there listed on this petition to get a permit that was signed by the Cherokee Committee that admitted them to citizenship and the ability to remain in place and be undisturbed during the removal, which is a pretty good operation. I have to say, that was signed by that was brought before the committee on the 22nd of June in 1837. It wasn't approved by the committee until May, 15th of May in 1838, right on the eve of the forcible removal. But you see, he included a list of people there with the numbers of people in their family. He says there's a total of 333 people represented there. And even though the Standing Wolf does not live on the Oconaluftee anymore, and he's in the Cherokee Nation, he shows up on this list. Standing Wolf shows up down there, and later on he says, in 1843, he gives testimony. He says, in consequence of his father by the name of Will Nody being a reservee, in other words, that he's already a citizen by virtue of that, and that he was averse to removing, that he had his name enrolled with the Cherokees of that town, Quallatown, on a memorial for citizenship, which was granted him and his family by the Cherokee Committee and the commissioners on the part of the United States. Of course, what he doesn't tell is what happened in between that. The next time we see this story come out in the American press is in 1853. And now it's a full-length feature article. It comes out in a newspaper called The Spirit of the Age. It's published in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is in February of 1853, that this story that is actually called Wauwatoga, or the Standing Wolf, appears in that newspaper, and then it gets picked up by newspapers all over the place. This story is different in its detail. That anecdote of a Cherokee Indian was very abbreviated. You know, it's just a short piece of a column in there, but it laid out those points. This is a full-length story in all its glory and all its detail. It bears the hand of this man, George Washington Hayes. George Washington Hayes, who was actually not identified as the author, but then in the reprints, he was identified as the author of this. George Washington Hayes was the person that the Washington correspondent had called Sergeant Bob, and to keep anonymous. And Hayes sees a reason in 1838 to clarify the whole event. And we'll look back as to why that might be. But I will say in advance that Hayes had served in the North Carolina legislature from 1840 up through 1852. And then he lost his 1852 election. And then this is published in 1853. Now, Hayes is a really interesting character. He also spends his childhood in the Oconaluftee and Tuckasegee River valleys, again with Cherokees as his primary neighbors. And by his own testimony, he says he lived a close neighbor to Standing Wolf. He was a contemporary and apparently a pretty close associate of William Holland Thomas. As a justice of the peace, he certified Thomas's power of attorney for the Quallatown citizen Cherokees in 1836. And Hayes was a fluent Cherokee speaker. So he translated for the councils of the people of Quallatown from 1835 to 1837 when they were deliberating what to do about the Treaty of New Echota and what to do with respect to the push for their removals. So he is completely informed about all of that. Now, Hayes begins his story by saying he is now posted in the fort in the Cherokee Nation. He is a sergeant in the North Carolina Mounted Volunteers, and they received their orders. This is a calendar, by the way, that these guys carried around in their pockets for June of 1838. And they had initially received their orders from the commanding general to begin arrest on June 4th. Now, that was later rescinded, but not before these guys went out and captured a bunch of people. So Hayes says that he was in one of these detachments preparing on June the 3rd. They go out on the morning of June 4th away from Fort Lindsay, and they go out into the communities on the northeastern edge of the nation, like Alarka or Yalagi and Yellowtown and Stickoa. And Hayes says, 2 other divisions went out to arrest an innocent and unoffending people. I was the interpreter of one of the parties. And that they'd woken up several groups of people and captured them. And then finally said, we came to the house of an aged patriarch with whom I'd been acquainted from childhood. He'd once lived a close neighbor to me. This was Waughcotoga, or Waughcotoga. His family consisted of 3 grown sons, 3 or 4 daughters, and a stepson. This is the description of the place he arrived at. This is their farm in Yellowtown, those property valuations from 1836 listing, the cabins that they lived in and the fields that they worked. So what he says is, on the arrival of the troops at his house, he and his family, that is the Standing Wolf and his family, were told that we had come to let them know that the general of the army required that he should leave all and go at once to the fort. I asked him for his firearms and those of his sons. He spoke to his sons. Each one stepped to the place of deposit and handed them to me. Now, they actually each one fired the live rounds into a tree before they handed the guns over. So they handed over their guns. They eliminated the threat of any kind of resistance. And Standing Wolf turns to him and he says, look, my children are almost naked and we're weaving out this web of cloth in the loom. Can you let Wakey and the girls stay here and finish out that cloth and bring them along with us so we can clothe everybody? And so Hayes apparently has the power to grant that request. And so the women folks stay at that cabin, and Standing Wolf pledges that he and his sons and stepson will come over to the fort. There's their spoliation claim from 1838. It even shows that loom they wove that cloth on. So then, just as we see in the 1846 story, he asked permission to pray. Standing Wolf asked to pray, and Hayes says, I, of course, unhesitatingly granted his request. And they took down the hymn book, the Methodist hymn book, because they were Methodists. They sang the anthems and praises of the Redeemer, and at the closing verse, fell on his knees. His wife and all the family followed. He pleaded the cause of his oppressors, and asked God to forgive them of their sins. That's a key point in both of these stories. And that's the reason the story gets repeated over and over and over again, not only in its original form in the press, but it gets chopped apart, and these are credited to other folks. But this is the origin of that story. He said he looked around upon his fellow soldiers and tears were streaming in every eye. Now, this story was told to another reporter in 1858, and he's actually there with the Standing Wolf, who he refers to as the famed Standing Wolf at this point. And he asked him about it because he had heard that the people there had wept like whipped children. And so he asked Standing Wolf through an interpreter, and Standing Wolf just said, well, we had a good time. They're exactly the sort of thing you would expect, an old Cherokee man like that to say, and certainly people with their Christian-like humility, as he points that out. So again, Hayes is impressing on the readers this moment in which Standing Wolf forgives the soldiers and forgives the whites for what they're doing. And he also emphasizes this moment of conviction for both himself and the soldiers who were there. He says that their lives were transformed by this moment. They travel, the family, at least Standing Wolf and his sons, traveled to Fort Lindsay. Standing Wolf is paroled and is able then to go back and forth between his old house to check on his family that's still there and back to the fort again. And he does that for the next week. Then by June the 12th, they're all at Fort Lindsay, which is there on the Nantahala River at the confluence with Little Tennessee. And at upper left, there's a view of that today. And they're at the fort for about a week. And then they're ready to leave. They're ready to march on off toward Fort Cass. And Hayes says, you know, we parted when he left, and I little thought that I'd ever see him again on this side of eternity. You know, so he thinks, or at least he says he thinks, that Standing Wolf has marched off to the west and he'll never see him again. Now, Hayes drops the narrative at this point because he's not with this group. He's not following them as they march along. And I'm going to rely on a few other records to sort of illustrate their route and experiences between here and Fort Cass. So this group takes off on what's called the Little Tennessee or the Tennessee River Turnpike. It's the only wagon road to Fort Lindsay. So they traveled this turnpike road along the Little Tennessee River to Franklin, North Carolina. And we know that because we have a wagoner's invoice for hauling their supplies and their subsistence and all of that. And he says that they go to Franklin, North Carolina, which is way out of the way. But it's the only place you can get to by wagon, and they have to have these wagons to travel. So they're on this wagon road from Fort Lindsay to Franklin. They pass through the old town of Cowee, pass through the mound there. They get to Franklin, they pass the old mound of Niquosi. So it's just, these are all the old familiar places for these Cherokee families who are all gathered together and marched away from Fort Lindsay. From Franklin, they take what's called the Great State Road, and it wasn't very great, but it was built in 1837, so it was pretty new at least. And they march along there and they cross the Waya Gap, which at 4,193 feet is the highest point on the Trail of Tears. They get to Camp Scott, which is under Nantahala Lake now. And Camp Scott had been gathering up all the families from the upper Nantahala River Valley, including the Standing Wolf's sister, Choyuka. And, you know, that's important because putting them back together, that relationship between brothers and sisters in traditional Cherokee society is very, very close. And he was supposed to be her protector. So getting them back together was an important thing. And they all march off together, all the prisoners from Camp Scott and the prisoners from Fort Lindsay, then traveling on toward Fort Butler and ultimately to Fort Cass. So they travel on from Camp Scott. They're moving along this Great State Road, and you can see the remnant of this Great State Road here. They get to Fort Lindsay on June the 29th. So they've been almost 9 days on the road getting this far. And the North Carolina Volunteers apparently are in no hurry to get them to Fort Butler. They travel from Fort Delaney, and Abraham Eustis, who's the commander of troops in North Carolina, is expecting them in any minute. He's just chomping at the bit because he wants to get out of there. He's trying to evacuate Fort Butler, and they've got to get everybody out of there. So he's waiting. He writes to Winfield Scott. He says, they're not going to arrive here until tomorrow evening. This is July 1st. He said, I expect to be able to send off the last detachment on the 4th. Well, he was frustrated in that because as they traveled from Fort Delaney, they got to John Welch's farm on the Valley River. They get there on June the 30th, but they stay there until at least July 2nd or July 3rd. And the reason they hit this hiatus is they encounter Preston Starrett, who's waiting for them there. And he was an agent for immigration. He was assistant to General Nathaniel Smith, the superintendent of immigration. He's also a Cherokee countryman. He's also in cahoots with a whole bunch of people to try to promote sort of the continuance of Cherokee people there in southwestern North Carolina. And he is writing out permissions. He says, Eustis says, to hundreds of Indians to remain in the country. He's been for several days at Welch's distributing permissions with a liberal hand to the Indians coming from Fort Lindsay and Camp Scott. They march on from there with their permits in hand, like this one you see here. This is a permit for Wege and Esopahee. They head for Fort Butler. They get down to Fort Butler, there at present-day Murphy, and Eustis confiscates all the permits and rescinds them, voids Stret's power to issue these permits, and basically closes that door for anybody else to avoid the removal. He also sends them off after they've only been there for just a few hours, and that's almost unheard of. They have no time to rest and recoup, but Eustis is steamed that he's having to wait around, and so he dispatches them from Fort Butler on July 4th under the command of Captain Jacob Peake and Tennessee volunteers, and they travel out along the Unicoi Turnpike. So they're moving about 8 miles to 10 miles a day. They go past Wacheese's place at Unaka. They go out to the Burnt Stand, which is actually operated by George Hayes's uncle. And George Hayes's uncle also grew up among the Cherokees on the Oconaluftee and speaks Cherokee. So he ends up being a principal in this whole affair. They get to Fort Armistead and they stop to rest for July 6th through July 8th. They're at this fort in Coker Creek, Tennessee. We have a requisition form from Peake where he's feeding their horses there on those dates. And then after they've rested up a little bit, they leave Fort Armistead, they go down through Tellico Plains, and they pick up various roads that take them through Athens, Tennessee, and then ultimately to Fort Cass, where they arrive on July 12th. And they cross the ferry there at Hiram Turks to get into Fort Cass. They arrive in what looks like, of course, this is the famed map of that immigration depot. And there are thousands and thousands of people there, probably more people than Standing Wolf and his family have ever seen assembled in any one place. And according to J.W. Lowry, Wiley Lowry, this place was just bustling and was probably like a madhouse around the agency. There were stores set up, everybody there to take economic advantage of what was going on with the Cherokee removal. He also noted that he said there were rumored to be 10,000 people all gathered up there. So Standing Wolf and his family come in, they're mustered in by Captain Page, and then they are allowed to find their places in the camps because they've arrived now right after John Ross and the Cherokee leadership have reached an agreement with Winfield Scott, first to delay the immigration until the onset of cooler weather, but that as part of that delay for the Cherokee Nation's part, they've agreed that they will now cooperate, that they will not pose any resistance to the Army in this immigration, that they will basically help Scott to complete his mission now that they were all captives. So that was the agreement, but it also meant that these thousands of Cherokee folks who were gathered up there had to form into camps that were now going to be long-term camps. They were going to last for months because they couldn't be released to go back to their homes. They were forced to encamp in this really pretty hellish place. Standing Wolf and his family go south and they go to Rattlesnake Springs. And they join the group that's already there at the Rattlesnake Springs on the southern edge of the immigration depot. They pass through a lot of their North Carolina neighbors on the way, going down the road through South Mouse Creek, and arrive at this place. And like these other camps, and this is a description of the South Mouse Creek camps, but the camps at Rattlesnake Springs are in the same way, that there's so many people there and there's so much sickness. There's whooping cough and dysentery going on that folks are just are dying right and left. And the sort of the level of misery in these camps is as extreme as you could imagine, especially given the fact that it's unremitting heat that summer. It was awful hot. It was, in the 90s at least every day after June. And here's where we pick up G.W. Hayes again. Hayes, then he says, after he said, I wouldn't see him again this side of eternity, he said, but so it was, we met him again in August. The transportation of the Indians would not be affected until October or November in consequence of low water. Having some unsettled business to attend to, I went to headquarters in August. And he makes it sound as though he just happened to go there because he had some business with the Army. He's no longer in the Army, by the way. He mustered out at the beginning of July. He's now a private citizen. So he's gone there to the agency. But he said his business was delayed and he concluded one Sabbath to go out amongst the Cherokees who were encamped some 3 miles from town at a large limestone spring called the Rattlesnake Spring, where I met my old friend Wauwatoga. And here I would draw into question that at least the coincidence that he seems to project here in that newspaper article, that he just happened to go to the agency and then he just happened to go to the Rattlesnake Springs. He passed through thousands of Cherokees in different camps to get to the Rattlesnake Spring. He was not simply touring the camps. He made a beeline for the Rattlesnake Spring. And of the many hundreds of folks who were at Rattlesnake Springs, he seems to have found Wauwatoga almost immediately. Standing Wolf makes his way through the crowd, seizes Hayes's hand before Hayes even saw him, and he asked me to remain until he brought his wife. I agreed to do so, falling into deep thought on the scene before me as I looked over the vast assembly then camped in the woods. It seemed but a moment had passed before he returned with his wife by his side. He brings Waggie, and then they're sitting down under a tree and she starts to tell their story. It said, 2 of our dear little ones have gone to the spirit land. Now, this is all in the flowery language of the 19th century. They're not talking like this. It says, the balance of our family is sick. We can never go west. We must all die. Is there no chance at all for us to get back to our old homes? Can you help us? We continued the conversation for some time while all wept. Hayes says, I had no help for them. I saw obstacles on every side, but finally, I told them to save their rations, whatever their rations they could, of the provisions that they drew, until they'd saved enough to travel with, and then to slip away from the camps at night and return to their old homes. The other thing he said is once you get back, your corn crop is safe, because as it would just so happen, I bought it at the sales, at the auction sales. And so I'm holding it and I will save it for you till you get back. And then Hayes says, I gave him this advice, whether it was right or wrong, and we parted. I had but little hope of ever seeing him again. In fact, there's documentary evidence. There's good documentation about that corn crop. Here's the returns from the sales of property. There's the Standing Wolves. And look, George Hayes was there at those sales. And on the second page, he buys the growing crop. So Hayes goes back home, which is on what's now Cooper's Creek in Swain County. Then it was Haywood County. And then the place was called Newton Mill Creek. And so he's there at home. He says, I spoke often of the old wolf and his family. And some 2 or 3 weeks had gone by when one day my attention was attracted to a company of Indians moving toward my house. At length, I recognized old Wauwatoga in the lead with 17 of his relatives following. Just to give you an idea about the relative position of this, there's where Hayes's house would have been on Newton Mill or Cooper's Creek at the time, relative to Standing Wolf's place at Yellowtown and where he ultimately ends up at Wolftown and Deertown. So these places are all pretty close together. They're 6 miles away from Koala Town when they stop at Hayes's. What's really going on when they stop at Hayes's is their case in the joint. They need to find out what's happening around that area before they go walking in. So Hayes says, I went out and met them, welcomed them to my house, gave them the best I had to eat. They consulted, we consulted on what he should do, told him to go live among his own people as they were just a short distance off, and the government could not remove them as they become landowners and subject to the laws of the state. And then he says, and that's where Wauakatoga still lives, in the enjoyment of good health. He's a good citizen. His hope is firm and steadfast. Now father, mother, sons, and daughters are happy and contented and are causing many to seek the religion which has given them so much comfort in the days past by. They live in Haywood County, setting a godly example for the white man. And that's almost the conclusion of Hayes's account. Here's the rest of the story. As my grandma would say, there was a wheel within a wheel. So first off, Hayes concludes his story with one statement that's about himself, because a lot of the story is really actually about Hayes in the background. As for myself, if I did anything wrong, I hope I may yet repent, but I never have yet felt any remorse of conscience for it. Some may blame and denounce me, so be it. Apparently, Hayes got accused of assisting and abetting Cherokees during the removal in his political campaign. And now he's coming back doing damage control, and he's doing it in the press. So that's his agenda for this newspaper article. There's other things going on. Hayes and the Washington Correspondent all make it sound like Standing Wolf just walked away. There were no consequences. They just walked away from these internment camps at Fort Cass, and they didn't look back and nobody looked after them. And they just went right over to Koala and moved in. That's not really the way it happened. Winfield Scott writes on September 4th, and this is right after the Standing Wolf has left. He said, all are impatient under this forced delay. To this impatience in great part is to be attributed the recent escape back to their old settlements of 8 or 10 families of North Carolina Indians. They'd settled their claims and entrusted their money to designing white men to purchase land at the sales now going on. Those designing white men were people like, in fact, they were George W. Hayes, William Holland Thomas, Emmanuel Schuler, Hayes's uncle, and a host of other people who were allies, secret allies to the Cherokees. Winfield Scott also, at that moment, he's got soldiers out in the mountains trying to bring in fugitives. So they're trying to get everybody together for this final push. But then he sends out another expedition to go into North Carolina to bring back, if possible, the recent fugitives. So there's a pursuit afoot for Standing Wolf and his family, but they're out ahead of it, and they make it to Hayes's before any soldiers get around there. They imagine, I guess, that Koala Town is being watched, because they also say that many people have escaped to Koala Town. That's the reason they stop at Hayes's, so they can case the place to see if they can get into Koala without getting caught. Eventually, Larned, who led that other expedition, was so frustrated trying to find people. He said, I therefore desisted from any further attempts and moved my whole command to the settlement on Oconaluftee River, occupied by those Indians who have obtained citizenship under the state of North Carolina, among whom I was informed many of the runaways had taken refuge, thinking they would be safe from pursuit or apprehension. Mr. W.H. Thomas, the agent for this settlement, accompanied me, and immediately upon my arrival, caused the whole to be assembled and ascertained that their number correspond with the list furnished by Mr. Thomas and those to whom citizenship had been granted, that is, 333. Guess who were among those 333, standing in the back? Standing Wolf and Wege and their family because they had signed that piece of insurance and they were on that list. So they were safe. They're in place. Lorna's expedition continues, trying to round up fugitives. Ultimately, things go very badly and it spins out of control with what we now know as the infamous Solly incident, where Solly and his sons put up the only active resistance to the military that we see during the whole episode. And ultimately that ends with the capture of Solly, his sons and sons-in-law, and their execution. And then finally a writ that basically gives exemption to those Cherokees who are remaining in North Carolina because the military is so anxious to get out of there and conclude the mission. So that's when that military part of the story ends, and Standing Wolf is now safely in place. Now his stepson and his nephews are part of the expedition that ultimately brings in Solly. So they continue to have a role in this whole episode. Later on, Hayes gives testimony about the Standing Wolf. He says he'd known him since 1820 or before, and that he said that because they didn't want to immigrate, they moved to Kuala. They obtained citizenship. So he just skims over this whole incident as though it never happened. And he said, said Indian was of good character, much to be relied on for truth, honesty, and sobriety as any man in his acquaintance. And he's saying this now 10 years before that newspaper article that he authors. We see then that after that newspaper article comes out, that everybody who goes to visit Kuala Town seeks out the Standing Wolf. The Standing Wolf is now the most famous character there. And so Elijah Keys from the Edgefield newspaper goes and he visits the Standing Wolf. He goes to a religious meeting at Standing Wolf's house. And that's where we have this eyewitness account of Standing Wolf's appearance. So he's a prominent citizen, not only among the Eastern Band, but he's really quite a celebrity in America, or at least among the reading public. And I'll end here by talking about some of his descendants. One of the best known of Standing Wolf's descendants is the beloved man, Dr. Jeremiah Jerry Standing Wolf, standing in parenthetically. But Dr. Wolf, Jerry, as we all who knew and loved him called him, you might have run into him before if you'd gone to the Museum of the Cherokee Indian before his death. He would greet you there, and he always had a kind word and a story. He never met someone who wasn't a friend. But everything that I see and hear attributed to the Standing Wolf, I hear it in Jerry's voice the whole time. You know, because Jerry seems to have been stamped out of the same mold as his progenitor, the old Standing Wolf, Wauwatoga. So I'm going to draw this to a close here, and we have some time for discussion and questions and answers, and I would be delighted to address any questions that you might have, or any comments that you might have or like to address. I'll stop this share so we can see everybody and talk. But if you have any thoughts or comments, you've got to unmute yourself.
All people's giving their thoughts for Brett. You heard Brett say they left the camps. They left the internment camps at Fort Cass and came back. Wakey, Standing Wolf's wife, gave birth on the way back. They named that child Comeback Wolf, appropriately so. And that is Jake's third great-grandfather that was born on the way back. So Jerry's grand, Owen's great-grandfather.
Come back, Wolf. And there are a lot of well-known Eastern Band members from this.
Very good, very good.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Hugh. Good to see you. One question that arose in my mind is, one, why didn't Standing Wolf get out before the removal started? He had a permit. And I think I would speculate there are good reasons. One, he had a lot of family members that were scattered out that he needed to gather up and bring back, including his sister and his maternal nephew, who would be like his son, and others. And the only way to do that was to allow the soldiers to gather them and then take them all away at the same time. The other thing I wonder is, why does Hayes show up down there? It's not an accident. You know, not only does he know Standing Wolf, and probably Standing Wolf was his friend, but he is an agent for William Holland Thomas. And Thomas can't be there himself. Thomas had contracted measles and had to be away from that place, even though he was there when the Standing Wolf arrived, setting up his store. He could not spring the Standing Wolf. They thought the immigration was going to start September 1st, and so it was was of the essence. He couldn't get the family out of there. Instead, Hayes, his agent, goes and does just exactly that. And why would Thomas want to do that? Well, if Thomas was the adopted nephew of the Standing Wolf, if the now young man who had taught him Cherokee was there in the same camps, if his friends and adoptive relatives were there and he had the power to get them out and bring them back to the community that he was helping, then he would do that. And so, you know, even though these newspaper articles are written as though these things just happened, they were just happy coincidence, I think it was far more than that. I think the escape of Standing Wolf and his family is actually an extraction from the camps. That's just my commentary, my speculations. Well, if y'all have been great, you hung in there the whole time in a long talk and my butchered Cherokee pronunciations. And, you know, I would say thank you. And ski, as they say here in the East, or wadon, as they say there in the West. And I'm looking forward to picking up and learning a lot from Mike's presentation here in just a little bit. So stay tuned for that. Don't go off anywhere, because the better and best is yet to come.
Brett,
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure thing.
Yeah, when I was doing the research for my book about my great-great-grandmother's family and so forth, it seems like some members of the family who were forced on the Trail of Tears actually went back in the early 1840s to Georgia. And one of the things I've always been interested in is how many people did that? Were there lots of people that actually went back to Georgia or Tennessee or North Carolina, et cetera, Alabama, or not? Is it rare?
There seems to have been a pretty substantial flow. You know, it doesn't amount to a whole lot of folks numerically, but you see a number of instances. You know, for instance, John Lusky. John Lusky, you know, staged the escape attempt on the trail, got away from Bushy Head's detachment, and then everyone gets recaptured. And at this point, Winfield Scott is worn out with that family. That family, which, by the way, includes Standing Wolf. And they throw John Lusky in the brig, and Winfield Scott says he should be taken west in chains. And he's kept back. Ultimately, he goes in the Drew detachment. He goes on the boat. He gets the river cruise. They get all the way out to Oklahoma. 1841, he turns right around and he rides a horse back. It takes him according to his account, 17 days to get back from Oklahoma back to North Carolina.
Okay.
So that sort of thing is going on, but there's also a continued flow of people from North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia westward, some of whom immigrate, some of whom just visit. So these folks are not cut off from each other, I think,
Yeah.
by any means.
Thank you.
Brett, where does Standing Wolf receive his spoliation claim payment?
That payment, that spoliation claim was not filed until the fourth board.
Okay.
So he's back home. What we do see is that payments for certain claims are received at Fort Cass in December of 1838, but they're received by William Holland Thomas as his agent. I don't think Standing Wolf wanted to tempt fate and get back there when all that was going on.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether he had gone to Fort or had allowed himself to go to Fort Cass as part
Yeah.
of potentially getting the payment to then facilitate being able to stay.
There's certainly that aspect. People, I mean, the major money that people would ever have was from valuations. In some cases, they're spoliations, but often the valuations of their real property. And it was an indication that that would all be paid out there. And many people did receive those payments there, although for some people it was sent on, and they didn't get full payment until they arrived. It seems like from the payment books, which Mike forwarded to me, and Anita also forwarded, that he didn't receive his valuation there at Fort Cass. Certainly not in full in any sense. And, he got out while the getting was good, and couldn't wait for that. A lot of people received those monies when the detachments formed up. And so he was certainly not in that group. But that might have been an incentive. That's a hard trip to make just to collect your money.
Right.
That group that left Fort Lindsay, including the folks who went on past Fort Cass and to the west, they had the longest trek of anyone who went on the Trail of Tears. That's the longest total route. They were about 120 miles from Fort Cass when they started at Fort Lindsay.
Brett, that was the most sophisticated PowerPoint I've ever seen. Was that PowerPoint or?
It was PowerPoint.
Well, I must have version 1 and you must have 10.
I have to keep my students entertained, so.
Well, they did good. Or you did good. That's
Well, it's quite a story, and I never feel like I can quite do justice to it. But it sort of expands and changes a little bit through time as we come up with more documents. But I think, among other things, it's pretty amazing that here's this family that you can track. This individual we can track really from 1820 or so right on up through 1864. But it's not simply that we track them. There are hardly any other instances where we have firsthand accounts, contemporary accounts from families and from individuals, as it was recorded by Hayes. And he was an eyewitness to all of this. Now, he had certain ways he turned that story, but he was right there. And because he was fluent in Cherokee, he knew what was going on.
Brett, have you made any stabs at looking for the Standing Wolf in Methodist Church records?
I haven't. Who shows up very prominently in the Methodist Church records are his son, And his son was there, you know, when Hay shows up, and that's Enoli, or the Black Fox. In fact, right downstairs from me, there's a Wiggins Black Fox, who's a direct descendant of Enoli, and the Standing Wolf works with us regularly. But they were very prominent in the Methodist Church, in the AME. Enoli preached at the mission, the Echota mission there, you know, on Soco Creek, wherever. And he was, although he died before James Mooney got there, his papers, James Mooney got a lot of Enoli's papers, which include, you know, not only things from the Wolftown Council and other things, but they also include a lot of medicine material.
Oh.
He was keeping track of that side as well as the Methodist side. One thing, you know, the Standing Wolf traversed a lot of the territory and a lot of the sites that I've worked on through the years as an archaeologist. And it was nice to have one narrative to kind of pull all those places together, you know, in this story. If you're ever out on the drive in between going from Bryson City to Robbinsville, you'll drive up and cross into Graham County. You'll see this store on your left, and it's the Wolf Creek Grocery. And Wolf Creek is named for Standing Wolf, because before he lived there, it was called Yellow Creek.
Brett, on your maps, you had a fort that I don't think I was familiar with. I think it was was it Fort Dudley? Was there a Fort Dudley?
Yeah, you're very observant, Vicki.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
It's Camp Dudley, and
Okay.
it has not really been on our radar. It is the really kind of the headquarters mustering point for the North Carolina troops. And it was their depot, their supply depot.
Okay.
And so everything came and went through Camp Dudley. They rented a couple of warehouses from Seiler there for all their stuff. And that really kind of explains why we have the record of the Wagner, who was Benjamin Britten, by the way, his wagons going to Franklin, because that's their point of resupply. And we don't have a precise location. We know it was in Franklin, and we know that the supplies were in Seiler's warehouses there, and that it was on that main road.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vicki was an eagle eye looking at that map.
Yes, I covet that map. I might send you an email asking for a copy of it.
Okay.
We need to figure out a way to get that kind of mapping done for all of the nation, all of the area associated with the removals. So,
Well, we're actually working on a project for the Forest Service and a parallel project for TVA here at Western Carolina, where we're doing cultural landscape inventories. And we're consigning all of that to a big GIS database. And so that database is, right now it's available to the federal agencies, where we've done all that remapping, of course, in great detail in North Carolina, but we've been trying then to pull in as much information as we can from the other states. And so Paige Tester has been in touch with a number of folks in the association in different chapters, trying to bring in information that we can provide to the agencies to help them not only plan, but to preserve these resources.
And is it the intention to do all of the area of the Cherokee Nation, or just
It is. And it's the intention of TVA to have us expand out to all of the removed tribes. I'm not sure how well that's going to work, but we're going to give it a try. But, you know, right now we're trying to incorporate the research from the various states, various state chapters. For the most part in states other than North Carolina. In North Carolina, we have amazing information because of Army surveys that were conducted there in 1837, where half of the houses are pinpointed. And so we're able not only to indicate the locations of these houses and all these improvements, but also that we can, very clearly delineate these communities. And the Army was specifically surveying and mapping the trails that interconnected that. So we have this entire network for southwestern North Carolina. You know, we don't have the same quality of information in the other states yet, but we're trying to incorporate everything we can from all of everyone's work, so that the agencies can really have this at their fingertips, so that if, there's a new road project starting up in Georgia somewhere, then the agencies, when they're called to consult, can say, oh yeah, there's high potential for resources in this area.
Have you talked with Aaron about ways that other National Park Service money might be able to go into this?
We haven't yet, because we've actually had all we could do so far with the Forest Service and TVA, but it really would be, and we've been in conversations with NPS about the project and shared data, but it would be, I think, useful to have it as an interagency type agreement. One of the things that we're doing, and I'll use this as a plug for what Mike's going to talk about, that the 1838 claims, is we're trying to now associate all these claims geographically within that database. So for instance, in North Carolina, we can place most of them typically within a mile of what they're referring to, and sometimes pinpoint them. In the other states, we're associating them at community levels. We're creating big polygons for these communities, and we then associate those records at the community level, which is right now as good as we can do, but I'm sure it can be improved in the future.
Have you all looked at what remains of the Georgia chapter's old TOTA base?
Yeah, to some degree we have, and we've incorporated a lot of that material.
Brett, I would just like to thank you for the presentation. I'm really new to the organization, and presentations like this just absolutely fuel my passion to become more involved and learn more and more. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that. What I hope is that, we do all this documentary research, and we find out where detachments are, and, schedules for everything. But the challenge I always have is trying to put a face on these things, to try to see what we can do to actually personalize the story. Because I think that's the way it has the greatest impact, on the public, is if we can personalize this thing. If we can name the people, if we can talk about what happened to them, if we can associate descendants and have descendants talk about that, then it becomes doubly powerful. So, but I really, really appreciate your thought about that.
Well, thank you.
Brett, next door to the Trail of Tears office, Betsy Walker's descendants, her granddaughters, 3 generations of them operate a cafe. And so if you can share with me some particulars about Betsy Walker and her cafe.
You mean old Miss Lowry Walker?
Yeah, Lowry Severe Walker, Elizabeth
Yeah.
Lowry,
well,
also known as Betsy Walker.
she was apparently an unequaled cook. And she was so skilled, and all of these Army officers and the agents of the War Department, Nathaniel Smith and those guys, begged her to come up and set up an inn at the agency, because as they came and went, they were out of places to stay and they didn't have anything fit to eat. And she said, she was like, no, I can't do that. And she bargained with them for an exemption. And there was a writ exempting her from removal for her cooking. And, that's some powerful cooking there. That's not just bean, bread, and grease. That's,
Yeah.
so, I mean, that's quite a story. Unfortunately, she died the next year, but, but she actually hung back because they had to make that promise in order to get her up there to do that, so that she could house all the federal agents and everybody who came in and give them not only room, but board.
Way to a man's heart is through his stomach.
Sure is. Sure is.
Troy,
Yes.
my wife and I are planning on going down to Tahlequah within about 2 weeks. And if her cooking was good enough for her to have gotten an exemption, if you could give me the name of the restaurant, because I definitely look to patronize that.
Well, it's called the Burger Barn. So they're not doing the fine cooking that Grandma Betsy was, but I thought that they're working on a Sunday. This place has been in business for 40 years. It flooded and they built it up, but they're working on a sign in Cherokee, but I wanted to fix them a little bit of something about the ancestor, and I need to get her. Brett will guide me to the primary source documents, so he won't have to get them out for me.
We got just the thing.
Thank you.
Okay,
Where-
it's at Weber's Falls, the Cultural Center of the Universe, and the headquarters for the Trail of Tears Association.
Thank you.
Capital of the Cherokee Dixieland, home of Walter Weber's brother-in-law, Stan Wadey. And there's another town across the river that we hardly say the name of. There's quite a story about that. The old timers used to say, yonder across the river, that other town. I've got to quieten down now. I don't, if I get my grin started, we'll get way off course.
If
And
there's ever,
He says that because some of my family was from the other town.
if there's ever any doubt of the effectiveness of the Trail of Tears Association and the research done by volunteers for the Trail of Tears Association, it would be in the tears streaming down this young man's face that just left this auditorium, hearing about his direct ancestor and the humbleness he has for this session today. So the impact, if you had seen that, is worth it all.
Was that Jake, Anita?
That was Jake. His
I-
coming,
When
but,
when Jake was with the Bike Riders, which I had the privilege of taking them to Rattlesnake Springs, and he told us the story of his ancestor being there, and tears were streaming then too. It was a very emotional place for him.
and
And I
when
agree
Brett,
with you that Jake is a fine person, and it's always good to see you.
it is, and when Brett gave the description of his grandpa Jerry Wolf and his countenance of being similar to what Standing Wolf's countenance would have been, that was an impact on Jake that he will never forget, Brett.
Thank you for letting me know that, Anita. I will say on a lighter note, a couple of years ago before COVID hit, I was having the privilege of teaching banjo to Jake's son. You know, so I was getting to probably corrupt Standing Wolf's descendant there.
How come playing your banjo wasn't part of your presentation?
Just couldn't work it in.
We'll have to book him, Curtis, to do that on our breaks.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And Jake's last name is what?
What did you say, Cleta?
Jake's last name is what?
Stevens.
Okay.
And maybe we could have Brett and Jay Hanna do a banjo duet at the 22 conference. Because it's just down the road. It's just down the road from Jay's hometown at Watts, or he's actually from, what do they call that?
Mosley's Prairie.
Mosley's Prairie.
But that's our 23 conference, not the 22.
That's right. We backed up a year again. Yeah, that's a long ways down the road, but that's something to aspire to, Brett.
Well, I would enjoy sitting down with Jay.
And as Jay likes to say, that Willie Nelson closed for his band.
Thank you again.
You.
Yes, Brett, we really appreciate it. That was a powerful presentation. Much.
Awesome.
Well, I very much appreciate it. Had a good topic, you know, it's easy to work with a topic like that.